Left on the freezing steps of a Yorkshire orphanage with nothing but a frayed coat and a cryptic brass key, 10-year-old Luke swore he would rewrite his destiny. 25 years later, a single dollar bought him a condemned fortress and unlocked a bloody $600 million secret buried within its walls. Before the tragedy that fractured his world, Luke Harrington's life was a tapestry of warmth, privilege, and history. His father, William Harrington, was one of Europe's most renowned antiquities dealers, a man who spent his life chasing forgotten relics across the globe. His mother, Catherine, was an architectural historian who filled their sprawling London townhouse with blueprints of ancient cathedrals and blueprints of lost estates. To 10-year-old Luke, his parents were invincible. But invincibility is a fragile illusion. On a rain-slicked highway, just outside of Edinburgh in November 1998, a speeding freight truck crossed the median. The collision was instantaneous. William and Catherine were killed on impact. Luke, who had been sitting in the back seat, miraculously survived with nothing more than a fractured collarbone and a traumatic silence that would haunt him for years. In the hospital, amidst the sterile smell of iodine and the relentless beeping of monitors, Luke's uncle arrived. Rickard Harrington was William's older brother, a cutthroat hedge fund manager in the City of London, whose suits cost more than most people earned in a year. Rickard had always viewed William's obsession with history as a pathetic waste of their family's pedigree. With Luke still in a neck brace, Rickard orchestrated a masterful, ruthless legal maneuver. He produced forged documents and leveraged a web of offshore shell companies to prove that William was not only completely bankrupt, but drowning in illicit debt. Within weeks, the London townhouse, the antiquities business, and the family's substantial trust funds were liquidated, absorbed into Rickard's corporate empire, to settle the estate's liabilities. But Rickard couldn't just take the money. He needed the heir out of the picture. Legally designated as Luke's guardian, Rickard drove the grieving 10-year-old to St. Jude's Home for Boys, a notoriously bleak state-run facility in the industrial outskirts of Leeds. "Your father was a fool, Luke," Rickard whispered coldly, standing on the steps of the orphanage as the icy wind whipped around them. "He died owing millions. Consider this a kindness. You'll learn how the real world works here." With that, Rickard turned on his heel, climbed into his chauffeured Bentley, and vanished into the fog. Luke was left with absolutely nothing except a heavy, strangely shaped brass key his father had desperately pressed into his hand as he was being pulled from the wreckage by paramedics. "Keep it hidden, Tommy." The eagle looks west, William had choked out with his dying breath. For the next 8 years, St. Jude's was a masterclass in survival. Luke endured the cruelty of older boys, the apathy of overworked wardens, and the bone-deep cold of a Victorian building that seemed to absorb joy. Yet the brass key, which he wore on a piece of stolen twine around his neck, became his anchor. It was the only tangible proof that his parents had existed, that he was loved, and that his father had left him with a final unsolved mystery. As he grew, Luke channeled his profound grief into an obsessive, burning drive. He spent every waking moment in the local public library, poring over the same architectural texts and historical records his mother used to love. He taught himself structural engineering, masonry, and European history. When he aged out of the foster system at 18, he didn't seek out his uncle. He knew that revenge required resources, patience, and absolute leverage. Instead, Luke disappeared into the blue-collar world. He worked grueling hours as an architectural restorer, dangling from scaffolding to repair the crumbling facades of Gothic churches across England and Scotland. He lived in a cramped, drafty van, saving every penny, quietly building a reputation as a master of historic masonry. But his nights were dedicated to his father's last words. The eagle looks west. It took 15 years of dead ends, late-night internet searches, and digging through digitized public records to finally crack the code. In 2023, while scouring an obscure Scottish municipal registry for condemned properties, a grainy photograph stopped his heart. It was a dilapidated 17th-century coastal fortress situated on a sheer cliff in Argyll. The stonework was collapsing, the roof was caved in, and the surrounding land was overgrown with blackthorn. The name of the property was Duncrest Castle. Above the rotting wooden portcullis, clearly visible even in the low-resolution image, was a stone carving of a double-headed eagle. Its head was turned sharply to the west. Duncrest Castle was a bureaucratic nightmare. Originally built in 1642 by an eccentric privateer, it had changed hands dozens of times over the centuries before falling into the possession of the local Argyll Council. For the past 4 decades, it had sat empty, rotting away in the harsh, salt winds of the North Sea. The council viewed Duncrest as a massive, dangerous liability. It was a protected heritage site, which meant they couldn't legally bulldoze it, but the cost to stabilize the ruins was estimated at a staggering £8 million. Desperate to offload the financial sinkhole, Mayor Robert Jenkins, a local politician desperate for a budget win, put the castle up for a heritage auction. The starting bid was £1. The catch, however, was buried deep in the draconian fine print. Whoever bought the castle would assume all legal liability for the structure. They were required by law to stabilize the main keep within 36 months. If they failed, the council would seize the buyer's remaining assets, impose a crushing fine of £2,000 per day, and pursue criminal negligence charges if the crumbling towers fell and injured anyone on the nearby public beach. It was a financial death trap. No developer would touch it. When 35-year-old Luke walked into the Argyll Municipal Building to place his bid, he was the only one in the room. Wearing steel-toed boots, faded jeans, and a weathered canvas jacket, he looked entirely out of place among the council members in their cheap suits. Mayor Jenkins smirked as he looked over Luke's paperwork. "You understand what you're buying, Mr. Harrington? You aren't buying a fairy tale. You're buying 50,000 tons of condemned rock. You miss the restoration deadline and we will bankrupt you." "I read the contract," Luke replied evenly, his voice rough from years of breathing in brick dust. He slid a crisp £1 coin across the polished mahogany table. "Do we have a deal?" "Mayor." Jenkins chuckled, sliding the coin into his pocket. "It's your funeral, son." On his first night at Duncrest, a brutal Atlantic storm rolled in. Luke had pitched a heavy-duty canvas tent inside what used to be the Great Hall. There was no electricity, no running water, and the roof above him was little more than a skeletal ribcage of rotting timber. As the rain lashed against the stone and the wind howled through the empty window frames, the sheer magnitude of what he had done set in. He had liquidated his life savings, roughly £40,000, just to pay for the initial legal transfers, structural scaffolding, and a diesel generator. If his father's dying words were the ramblings of a concussed man, Luke had just willingly signed his own financial death warrant. But Luke was a master mason. He knew how buildings breathed. He knew how they were constructed. For the first 3 months, he worked 18-hour days. He hauled fallen ashlar blocks by hand, mixed traditional lime mortar, and secured the most dangerous archways. The locals thought he was a madman. Mayor Jenkins even drove up to the property line, occasionally sipping coffee from his warm car, waiting for the inevitable collapse of Luke's sanity and the fortress itself. The breakthrough happened on a frigid Tuesday morning in November. Luke was working in the western wing, the direction the Stone Eagle was looking. He was utilizing a laser measuring tool to map the interior dimensions of the ground floor corridor so he could order custom timber supports. He measured the interior hallway 42.5 feet. He walked outside into the freezing rain and measured the exterior wall 68 feet. Luke stopped. He wiped the rain from his face and stared at the digital readout. He measured it again. Then a third time. Even accounting for the massive 3-foot-thick defensive walls standard in 17th century Scottish castles, there was a discrepancy of nearly 20 feet. 20 feet of dead, unaccounted-for space between the interior corridor and the outer cliffside wall. His heart hammering against his ribs, Luke grabbed his heavy sledgehammer and a high-powered halogen flashlight. He ran back into the gloom of the western wing. He walked slowly down the corridor, running his bare hands over the freezing, damp stonework. He was looking for signs of a later addition, a shift in the mortar, a change in the stone-cutting technique. Halfway down the hall, hidden behind a thick layer of creeping ivy and century-old black mold, he found it. A faint, almost imperceptible seam in the masonry, shaped like an arch. The mortar here wasn't the traditional lime mix used in the 1600s. It was harder, more modern. Swinging the 12-pound sledgehammer with all his strength, Luke struck the center of the arch. The sound wasn't a dull thud. It was a sharp, hollow crack. He swung again and again, adrenaline flooding his system, entirely oblivious to the exhaustion in his shoulders. On the 15th strike, a large rectangular block gave way, tumbling backward into darkness. A rush of stale, dry air poured out of the hole, carrying the unmistakable scent of old paper, oxidized metal, and dust. Luke widened the hole, grabbed his halogen light, and squeezed his shoulders through the jagged opening. He found himself standing in a narrow, pitch-black vestibule that clearly hadn't seen the light of day in decades. At the end of the vestibule was a heavy, reinforced steel door, the kind used in mid-20th century bank vaults. It was entirely incongruous with the medieval castle. In the center of the steel door was a complex rotary locking mechanism, and right in the middle of the dial was a single, oddly shaped brass keyhole. With trembling hands, Luke reached beneath his shirt and pulled out the twine necklace. He detached the heavy brass key he had carried every single day since he was 10 years old. He stepped forward, his breathing echoing loudly in the cramped, silent space. He slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a deep breath, he turned it. A heavy series of metallic clicks echoed through the dark, followed by the deep, agonizing groan of internal deadbolts sliding back. Luke grabbed the rusted iron handle and pulled. The heavy door swung open, revealing a meticulously climate-controlled reinforced bunker. Luke shined his light inside, and the beam illuminated something that made his knees go weak. Stacked floor-to-ceiling against the far wall were hundreds of heavy wooden crates, each stamped with the seal of the Bank of England and the insignia of a prominent 19th-century private banking firm. But it wasn't just the crates. Sitting on a mahogany desk in the center of the room was a leather-bound ledger, and next to it, a modern waterproof briefcase. Luke opened the briefcase. Inside were neatly organized rows of bearer bonds, uncut diamonds in velvet pouches, and a series of legal documents bearing the signature of his father, William Harrington. The fortune inside this room wasn't an ancient pirate hoard. It was his family's actual wealth, a staggering multi-generational fortune, carefully hidden away by his father, just weeks before the car crash. William had known his brother Ricard was plotting against him. He had known his life was in danger. As Luke opened the ledger, his eyes fell upon the final entry, written in his father's frantic, recognizable scrawl. "If you are reading this, Tommy, I am dead, and Ricard has taken everything. But he only took the shell. The Empire is here. Reclaim your name, my son, and destroy him." The estimated value of the bearer, bonds, the diamonds, and the historical artifacts in the crates behind him was later appraised at just north of $600 million. But for Luke, sitting in the dust of a ruined castle he had bought for a single coin, the real prize wasn't the money. It was the weapon he had just been handed to utterly annihilate the uncle who had left him to rot. For 3 days, Luke did not leave the castle grounds. He barricaded the heavy steel door, obscuring the jagged hole in the masonry with a stack of rotting tapestries and collapsed timber. He slept in short, fitful bursts on the damp stone floor of the corridor, his mind working with the clinical structural precision he normally reserved for restoring Gothic arches. He knew that if he simply walked into a police station with the bearer bonds and the ledger, Ricard's army of corporate lawyers would descend upon Argyll within hours. Ricard would claim the vault was part of William's unsettled estate, tie the assets up in Chancery Court for a decade, and likely find a way to legally seize Duncrest Castle in the process. Luke had zero financial footprint, no legal representation, and the lingering stigma of being a ward of the state. He needed capital, and he needed it outside the British banking system. Sitting in the dim light of his generator, Luke opened the leather-bound ledger to study the architecture of his uncle's crimes. William had not just hidden his money, he had compiled a meticulously documented dossier of Ricard's financial treason. In the late 1990s, Ricard's hedge fund was on the brink of insolvency. To save his empire, Ricard had secretly used Harrington Antiquities Williams' pristine, globally respected business to launder millions of pounds for a syndicate of corrupt Eastern European steel magnates. When William discovered the fraud and threatened to go to the authorities. The fatal car crash happened just 3 weeks later. The ledger contained account numbers from private banks in Zurich, routing codes for shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and exact dates of wire transfers bearing Ricard's signature. But alongside the evidence, William had left his son a roadmap for survival. Tucked into the back pocket of the ledger was a sealed envelope containing the business cards of a few trusted discreet contacts who owed William their lives. A week later, Luke boarded a cheap Ryanair flight to Brussels, wearing his cleanest work clothes and carrying a heavy, unassuming thermos in his duffel bag. Inside the thermos, packed tightly beneath a layer of ground coffee, were 12 uncut, conflict-free South African diamonds from the vault. He took the train into the heart of the Antwerp diamond district. Following his father's notes, he bypassed the glittering retail storefronts and walked into a dingy, unassuming cutting facility on Pelikanstraat. He asked for Hendrik van der Weyden. The man who emerged from the back office was in his late 70s, his eyes magnified to enormous proportions by a jeweler's loupe. When Luke placed William's handwritten letter and a single flawless 50-carat rough diamond on the felt pad between them, the old man wept. "Your father saved my family from bankruptcy in 1988. Hendrik whispered, his voice trembling as he held the stone to the light. "We all believed you died with him in that hospital, Luke. We thought Ricard had smothered the bloodline." Hendrik facilitated the quiet sale of the stones through private, unlisted auctions. Within 48 hours, an anonymous offshore trust in the Isle of Man, entirely controlled by Luke, was funded with 22 million euros. Armed with untraceable capital, Luke returned to London. He didn't go to the police. He went to Clifford Chance, one of the most ruthless, high-powered corporate law firms in the elite magic circle of London. Luke walked into their glass-panelled lobby in Canary Wharf, looking like a vagrant who had taken a wrong turn, but the multi-million-pound retainer he wired from his offshore trust secured him an immediate meeting with Arthur Penhaligon, a senior partner, known for tearing rival corporations to shreds. "I don't just want my family's estate back, Mr. Penhaligon," Luke explained, spreading his father's ledger across the polished mahogany boardroom table. "I want Rickard Harrington stripped of everything he has ever built. I want his reputation decimated. And I want him to spend the rest of his life in a concrete room smaller than the one he threw me in." Penhaligon adjusted his spectacles, reading through the wire transfer records and the laundering evidence. A slow, predatory smile spread across the lawyer's face. "Mr. Harrington, this isn't a lawsuit. This is an execution. But if we are to catch your uncle, we cannot chase him. We must make him come to us." They devised a masterful multi-tiered trap. First, Luke returned to Scotland and aggressively accelerated the restoration of Duncrest Castle. He hired a crew of 60 local stonemasons, electricians, and engineers. He imported custom Norwegian timber and Spanish slate. He paid the Argyll Council their required stabilization fees, in full wiping the smug smile off Mayor Jenkins's face permanently. To the outside world, a mysterious, wildly wealthy developer was sinking tens of millions into a worthless ruin on the coast. It took exactly 3 months for the ripples to reach the City of London. Rickard Harrington, whose hedge fund was, ironically, suffering from a severe liquidity crisis due to bad investments in commercial real estate, caught wind of the massive capital expenditure happening in Argyll. His corporate spies dug into the public permits and discovered the name of the project lead, Luke Harrington. Rickard was furious, but he was also greedy. He assumed that Luke had somehow stumbled upon a massive undiscovered natural resource on the castle grounds, perhaps lithium or offshore oil rights, and had found private backing. Rickard's arrogance blinded him to the truth. He believed his nephew was still a naive, uneducated orphan, playing out of his depth. Rickard initiated a hostile legal maneuver, filing an injunction in the Scottish courts to halt the Duncrest restoration, claiming that as Luke's former legal guardian, he held historical claims to any properties purchased by the Harrington estate. He demanded a meeting to settle the dispute out of court. He had taken the bait. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Rickard's penthouse office in Canary Wharf, 50 stories above the River Thames. The room was a monument to cold, sterile wealth, chrome black leather, and abstract art that cost more than St. Jude's Orphanage's operating budget for a decade. Rickard sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 junior lawyers in tailored Italian suits. He was in his late 60s now, his hair completely silver, but his eyes retained the same dead reptilian calculation that Luke remembered from the hospital room 25 years ago. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Luke walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a heavy rain-soaked canvas jacket, faded denim, and the scuffed steel-toed boots of a working mason. He walked with a quiet, grounded gravity, taking a seat at the opposite end of the massive table. He didn't bring any lawyers with him. He carried only a single waterproof briefcase. Rickard leaned back, steepling his fingers. He let out a patronizing sigh. "Look at you, Tommy. Playing the rugged architect. I must admit, I was surprised you didn't drink yourself to death in the gutters of Leeds. Now you've somehow conned some venture capitalists into funding a Scottish ruin. But you're out of your depth. Sign the deed to Duncrest over to my firm, and I'll give you £1 million to walk away. Fight me, and I'll tie you up in litigation until you're bankrupt again." Luke didn't blink. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the heavy, strangely shaped brass key, and set it on the glass table. The heavy clack of the metal echoed in the quiet room. Rickard's gaze dropped to the key. For a fraction of a second, the confident veneer cracked, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion, then deep, creeping dread. He recognized the shape. It was the key to his brother's private lockbox, the one he had spent 6 months tearing the London townhouse apart to find after the crash. "You always thought my father was a fool, Rickard." Luke said, his voice low and steady, vibrating with a quarter-century of suppressed rage. You thought he cared more about dead history than the real world. But history is just the study of foundations, and my father knew exactly how weak yours were. Luke unlatched his briefcase. He didn't pull out the deed to the castle. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, freshly printed on the heavy watermarked stationery of Clifford Chance. He slid the first document across the long table. That is a sworn affidavit from Hendrik van der Weyden in Antwerp, confirming the sale of 22 million euros in rough diamonds. Diamonds my father legally purchased in 1996 and hid from you. Luke slid a second document across the glass. That is a forensic audit of the Cayman Island shell companies you used to drain my family's trust. Account numbers, routing details, and the forged signatures you used while I was lying in a hospital bed with a broken neck. Ricard's face drained of color. His junior lawyers suddenly looked terrified, instinctively leaning away from their boss as if he were radioactive. "And this," Luke said softly, sliding a final thick binder across the table, "is a copy of the ledger. The original is currently sitting on the desk of the Director of Enforcement at the Financial Conduct Authority. A secondary copy was hand-delivered to the Economic Crimes Division of Interpol in Lyon 3 hours ago." You bluffing little rat," Ricard hissed, though his hands were trembling violently. He lunged for the binder, frantically flipping through the pages. His eyes darted across the copies of the wire transfers to the Russian syndicates. "This is circumstantial. It's 20 years old. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to active ongoing fraud concealment," Luke interrupted smoothly. "My legal team, whom I have on a £10 million retainer, has spent the last month tracing those 1998 accounts to the very real estate derivatives currently keeping your hedge fund afloat. You didn't just steal my money, Ricard. You built your entire house of cards on it." Luke stood up slowly, buttoning his damp canvas jacket. "I bought a condemned fortress for $1, Luke said, looking down at the man who had ruined his childhood. "Because I know how to fix broken things. But you don't know how to build anything. You only know how to steal." As if on cue, the muffled, heavy sound of the office's secure elevators chiming open echoed through the frosted glass of the boardroom. Heavy footsteps marched across the marble lobby. The boardroom doors were thrust open, not by Rickard's secretary, but by 6 plainclothes, officers from the City of London Police's Economic Crime Directorate. Rickard Harrington, the lead investigator, asked, flashing a badge. "You are under arrest for suspicion of severe financial fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. We have a warrant to seize all servers' physical files and assets on this floor." Ricard sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified realization of total defeat. As the officers moved in to read him his rights and pull him to his feet, Ricard locked eyes with Luke. "Tommy, please." Ricard choked out his voice, suddenly sounding frail and pathetic. "I'm your family." "My family died on a highway in Edinburgh," Luke replied coldly. He picked up his brass key, slipped it back into his pocket, and walked past his uncle without another word. By the following spring, the financial markets had brutally dismantled Rickard Harrington's empire. The sheer scale of the fraud, combined with the ruthless precision of Luke's legal team, ensured that Rickard's assets were frozen globally. He was denied bail and remanded to HM Prison Wandsworth, awaiting a trial that carried a maximum sentence of 30 years. Luke, meanwhile, returned to the cliffside in Argyll. The restoration of Duncrest Castle was completed in 2025. It did not become a private mansion or a luxury resort. Using the vast $600 million fortune reclaimed from his father's vault, Luke established the William and Catherine Harrington Foundation. The castle was transformed into an elite, fully funded educational academy and trade school, specifically designed for children aging out of the UK foster care system. Where there were once crumbling, dangerous ruins, there were now state-of-the-art engineering labs, historical restoration workshops, and warm, fire-lit dormitories. Luke Harrington, the boy abandoned, with nothing but a frayed coat, had not just survived. He had taken the stones of his trauma and built a fortress that would stand for centuries, a place where no child would ever have to face the freezing winds of the world alone. Wow, what an incredible journey from a $1 ruin to a $600 million empire of justice. If Luke's story of resilience, master planning, and ultimate payback gave you chills, you have to hit that like button. Share this unbelievable true-life drama with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on these jaw-dropping stories of secrets hidden right beneath our feet. Let us know in the comments what you would do if you found a secret vault.